let's start from the beginning, Vicky. We've got lots of questions here that really wanted to understand a bit more about where Belbin came from, you know, the theory, etc. And I mean, that's quite wide ranging. So let's narrow it down a little bit. How did Belbin come to being? Is it about individuals? Is it a personality tool? What is it? And that's enough of me talking. Over to you.
Okay, so I think Belbin's quite unique in some ways in that there was no sort of historical framework or philosophy that was kind of imposed on the work that Meredith did. So the people that he gathered together, they went through psychometric tests and he looked at all kinds of characteristics, but he wasn't trying to kind of prove anything. He wasn't trying to impose a certain system. He didn't think, oh, you know, this might be handy or this might market well. What he was doing was starting off with a hypothesis. Why do some teams work better than others? And it was very open. It was a case of, let's try it and see what works. And what he wanted to know was primarily about the team. And looking at individual contributions kind of arose out of that. But the primary focus was on the team. What makes some teams work and others fail? How do people contribute? How can we observe what people are doing? And what do we see? And how can we sort of organise what we see and use that to help other teams perform better? So that was the origin, if you like. And it was very scientific in that when they met with problems and hypotheses that didn't work out, they learned from those. They didn't say, oh, well, actually, that doesn't fit what we want, so we'll just kind of push that to one side. It really was a case of let's start with teams and see what we can learn.
So the fact that there are 9 Team Role behaviours came out, you know, that was interesting, wasn't it? But it wasn't what they were necessarily expecting. They weren't expecting anything about behaviours in a way. They were just saying, what is it that makes a team successful? It just happened to be that these 9 Team Role behaviours came out of it.
Yeah, they didn't start necessarily with behaviour. And if anyone knows about Apollo teams, you'll know that Meredith started with saying, okay, let's examine the basic principle first, that if we've got a team of really clever, as he put it, very academic people, then that team should succeed. He thought he was just getting that out of the way. It was obvious. And in fact, what they found, of course, was that teams that contained lots of very academic and individuals who focused very much on their own achievement actually weren't the best, most effective teams. Because what he found was there was lots of ego, everybody wanted to sort of push things in their own direction, and there was very little cohesion. So actually, even from the outset, he was sort of finding that teams didn't behave as he thought. And then once the observations became sort of more in terms of looking at different clusters of behaviour, then they could begin to look at balance, what teams needed, and how they could sort of tinker with that to make effective teams. So yeah, it was very much a case of starting with what the team needs and then trying to organise these behaviours into patterns. And that's where team roles came from. And I think it's quite useful to have that as a starting point, because it then informs your understanding when you're talking to people. It's not about labelling or putting someone in a box. It's about looking at these different individual behaviours, how we can observe those and how we can sort of turn those into practical outcomes in terms of performance.
That's perfect. Oh, my sound's gone a bit. But what was also quite interesting was that we looked through the archives, didn't we, a few years ago now, to find out a little bit more about the work that was done at Henley sort of in the late 60s. And it was, I think, a period of like 9.5 years of going to Henley from Cambridge and, you know, taking part in all of this analysis and what have you. And the amount of work and data filled boxes upon boxes upon boxes of stuff, and we were going through that. Vicky, do you want to share this? Because people don't normally see this, and I thought, as we've got Vicky with us, let's share some of that wonderful stuff from Henley. Okay. I can see that Vicky's trying to share her screen now.
Bear with me a moment. Yeah, just bringing this up. Okay. So yeah, this is one of the original observation sheets from 1969. And what was going on here was that Meredith was working with a research team, and that team were all trained really meticulously. So these training manuals that go on for, you know, it's kind of volumes and volumes, in order to observe how people were reacting in their teams to the management exercise that they were undertaking. So what you can see is that every 30 seconds, you can see down there on the left-hand side, they were making an observation about how the individuals were interacting. And here, this is a little further along the line than one of the earliest, because they've actually begun to, as well as their numerical sort of notations that they were using, they've begun to use the team role abbreviations. So they're noticing these patterns. And you can see there's monitor evaluator, there's plant, there's CW, which is company worker, which is the old name for implementer. So what they were doing was every 30 seconds, they were sort of saying, okay, how are people contributing? How is this shaping the way that the team's performing? And that way they could begin to build up a picture of what had happened in the team. So this is like, this is really early, but it's big data essentially. And then, the late 1960s, this is the way that they went about it. It's really kind of meticulous, starting off with the completed finisher as we see it, but then building up the bigger picture of what was happening in the team. So yeah, this was over 10 minutes, believe it or not. This was what they observed.
I find that incredible, and I'd just like to reiterate that this is Bale's analysis, and this is 10 minutes of work, but they were observing what was going on in the teams at Henley every 30 seconds, weren't they? I mean, this is people.
There must have been reams upon reams by the time they finished.
This is really big data, but handwritten, isn't it?
Yeah.
And this is incredible. So all of this information, what's going on with these teams, and these teams are teams of 4. They're playing a game an exercise called Teamopoly, where there was a financial outcome, and it was devised to allow as many different behaviours, well, just to be as sort of far-reaching as possible. And yes, whilst they were doing this, Bale's analysis was there. Thank you. What was the people are asking actually? What types of people did attend the Henley Management College?
All right. Well, if I flip on to, I'm just going to check this is going the right way. It is. No, sorry, I'll just stop sharing for a minute. And I've got another slide which I can share with you. Traditionally, obviously, this was the end of the 1960s, and a lot of these were managers. So there was definitely a predominance of men that were attending these courses. But in terms of culture, this course seemed to attract people from all over the world. And if I just share with you, again, this is from our archives. There are some pictures missing, they just weren't present in the original. It's not that I've taken them out, but this was 2 pages of the attendees, and we've taken the names out. But you'll see there were people from India, Nigeria, Malaysia, South Africa, lots from the UK, obviously, and Ireland. But there was a really sort of cross-cultural input, even into the original analysis, which I think is interesting to see, for that time, that this wasn't a UK-only test, and therefore, fortunately for us, has meant that Belbin can and has been used all over the world, that the language of team roles is a universal language.
I love this slide. I really do. But it does show, the people who did attend Henley were those managers who are already sort of earmarked for the higher echelons of management. So these, I suppose it's like a mini MBA in a way. It was 6 weeks where you'd go to Henley. And the reason that Henley actually noticed that some of these teams were working and some of them weren't is because Henley were the first management college, business school, to use syndicate working, weren't they, as part of the way they wanted people to learn. So instead of them being just a normal sort of lecture style or what have you, they did put people together and wanted them to learn by sharing in a syndicate. And this is why they suddenly realised some were working and why some weren't. And no, thank you for sharing that. But it does show, doesn't it, there was more of a cultural inputs than originally that we maybe thought to start with, but not many females.
Not at that time, no.
Yeah. And so how has it developed, do you think? I personally think that would there be a difference, I suppose, if there's more females there. I think they would have found the same things, because behaviours, remember, we're looking at behaviours, aren't we? What behaviours were there after finding out what was a team? So we weren't looking at whether or not they're male or female. But no, I'd like to think if we did that again, there would be 50-50 photographs, wouldn't you?
I would hope so, yeah. And I think when we're looking at, as you say, we're looking at contribution, we're looking at the role that someone can play in a team, and obviously the functional role would kind of inform that. So I think when, dependent on the culture of the organisation and, those kind of constraints, that all kind of influences behaviour as well. So I think, in a modern setting, we would find those roles amongst women too.
Oh no, absolutely. Actually, this is an interesting one that's just come up, is we talk about behaviour. How does that differ from personality?
Okay, well, our personality is relatively fixed, barring maybe sort of exceptional changes in our circumstances in life. Behaviour is something that we adapt according to maybe the jobs that we're in, the project we're on, the people we're working with. So behaviour is a lot more fluid, and that's why it's important when we're looking at team roles to understand that our behaviours can change over time, and they can change sort of as we mature. If we're sort of aware of team roles, we can cultivate different roles as we need to, really, as the team needs.
So it's not fixed, it's not who I am, it's, I suppose, what I do, how I interact with others.
Exactly, and I think that's quite a liberating thing in a way, because if you're not happy perhaps with how your strengths come across with Belbin, then within reason, it's rare that we see team roles flip completely. But if your observers, for example, noticing different strengths than you see, then it's up to you to some extent to articulate what your strengths are and to work on those, maybe your manageable roles, so that others are seeing the same things that you think that you're capable of.
You've just used the word observers, Vicky. Some people may not know what observers are. Do you want to talk a little bit more about, because Belbin, as some of you may know of Belbin Team Roles as something you've studied on a course. It could be that you've read an article about Belbin and you've been told just guess, which team roles you are, which is obviously only as useful as the person and how well that person's actually explained them in the first place. To really find out your Belbin, how you feel about each of these 9 team roles, you have to complete a questionnaire, and this questionnaire is called the Self-Perception Inventory, and it's all computerized, and you should get something that looks like this, lots of pages of beautiful advice and stuff. That was technical, wasn't it? So that's the way you find out your team role profile. If you've filled in a paper copy and you've just added up scores, that's not Belbin. That is just something purporting to be. So that's how I see myself. What role do the observers have, Vicky? Why bother asking other people?
Well, this kind of feeds into the personality behaviour thing, because with personality, that's within you. That's something that it's for you to say, really. With behaviour, we're looking at we're observing, just like Meredith was with that original research. We're looking at how other people behave, and others, our colleagues, are kind of influenced by and affected by our behaviours all the time. So with the observer assessment, what we're doing is we're adding the feedback of colleagues, managers, people who work with you and know you pretty well in a work context, and we're using that to inform the whole kind of overall picture of your team roles, and that's really key, because with self-reporting measures, which some are, you're really limited. You're kind of in an echo chamber of your own view, really, and you don't get this rounded picture of how your behaviours come across to other people, and that's one of the most valuable things I think about Belbin. It's this kind of evidence base, and that's, I think, where the learning is as well, because you can see the differences between your own views and other people's. You can decide whether there are things that you want to adapt about your behaviour. You can look, for example, we were saying earlier, I think that you see different behaviours than others that I work with, because it's a very different context. And I think with managers and people that work for you, you can adapt your behaviours as well. So it just gives you a fuller picture of how you're behaving, and how to sort of make that work for the team, rather than just being something that's about you.
Which is so fascinating, isn't it? Because you're right, we don't want to be in our echo chambers. You know, I am a strong resource investigator, coordinator, shaper, but if nobody else is seeing those strengths, I need to know that, don't I? And if people are seeing different strengths, I need to be aware of that to be able to grow. And remember, this is a work-based tool, isn't it? It's how useful can I be to the team? What is the contribution that I am making to the team? And you want that contribution to be the best it possibly can and the most informed it possibly can for the team to actually succeed. So I think, yeah, it's very much those observers are adding that extra context.
I think that's why we get that comment that Belbin is so useful kind of in practical terms, that it makes real changes to, you know, the way that we do things. Because some of us, when it comes to personality, some of us don't necessarily show that much of our personalities at work, whereas others are much more open. So I think when we're focusing on behaviour and a work context, it's sometimes a more comfortable place to start the conversation as well.
Yeah, no, very much so. So we just talked about behaviour. And the fact that it can change, which is beautiful because it goes straight to a question that Debbie's just asked actually, is how often should you complete a new Belbin? How regular should that be?
Oh, I guess there's no hard and fast rule, but I'd say if you know, if you're working in a new project or a change of functional role, that's often a good time to kind of review. In terms of the observer assessments, obviously if you're new to somewhere, it's going to be difficult for people to comment on your behaviour. So we tend to recommend that you leave it a few months so that people get to know the real you, if you like. But in terms of the SPI, I think because it's a snapshot, it's useful, you know, if you feel that things change over time. I don't know what you'd say, Joe, maybe a year or so. It's useful to kind of revisit and see, because I know that my team roles have changed enormously since joining Belbin, and that is partly changing functional role as well.
And also finding and growing and getting into those roles that you actually know you can perform really well in, isn't it? I think when you first start off, and I think we may have a slide here, I'm going to give you time by talking to find it. But I think that as we go through life, we change and we develop and we learn, don't we, about these different roles. And
absolutely.
I know that you looked at the data, didn't you, of how team roles and age, and I thought this was really interesting. Do you want to talk?
Yeah. So this was, we looked at, gosh, I think it was about 300 or so over a few years. We actually asked some questions at the end of our SPI, which is really useful stuff for us in research terms to kind of get some of these other characteristics, what kind of industry people are in, their age group. And here we were sort of asking a number of questions, but the age group one really gave rise to some interesting findings. So you can see the team roles, forgive me, they're not team role colours. Sorry, Joe. They're near enough. But what we can see is that the coordinator role, the one that requires that kind of maturity, breadth of perspective, others sort of consulting you, coming to you for advice, that increases with age. So obviously it's quite difficult to come in as a graduate to an organisation and begin delegating work and chairing meetings. It's not the experience that most of us have. So the opportunity to show that role maybe isn't as much there at the beginning, but we do see that kind of increasing over time. And the idea is that if you know that that's there in your profile, maybe there are other ways that you can explore that cluster of behaviour, whether that's, you know, identifying talent in others, but there are ways to sort of use and cultivate that, and we see that sort of growing over time. And it's interesting to note that as that contribution goes up, we see other things like the completed finisher, the attention to detail kind of declines a little bit, I guess because of that tension between focusing on the bigger picture and kind of delving into the detail. And another thing which you can't see from the graph, but that we found from the research, was that people in the older age groups were much more defined in terms of their strengths. So, for example, they'd have maybe 3 really strong preferred roles and then other things that they didn't do. Whereas for people in the younger age groups, they were still sort of finding their feet in terms of team roles. So there was a lot less sort of difference between the roles in terms of their scores. And I think that's why, you know, with GetSet, with our offering for younger people, our advice is quite different. It's really about sort of trying out different things and cultivating different skills. And then you become sort of more definitive, as you say, Joe, you come to know your strengths maybe a bit more. When you get older, you become a bit more definitive.
Yeah, I think that's true, isn't it? As we get to understand where our strengths are and we play them, and my goodness, it really worked, we do tend to therefore play that role again. But I think this is fascinating. And it's going back to that behaviour, isn't it? You can develop these things. Belbin Team Roles isn't static. It isn't a case of I am this, I will always be this. And I know that we have conversations in the office that people, if they haven't done Belbin properly, by just guessing or whatever, it can give the wrong impression. Whereas actually what we're talking about are behaviours, and some of them can be learnt and can be developed over time, and remembering it's what the team needs you to do as well, and what the team needs you to be, which also has that influence there. But thank you. I'll send you the actual colour codes if you would like for our actual team.
Sorry.
That's wonderful. So I hope that's answered that for you, Debbie. I think one way, somebody put it beautifully actually, and some of you will be familiar with this, is the cholesterol check analogy, is that you go to the doctors, don't you, to find out your level of cholesterol. The doctor gives you the output and tells you to go away and do various things and then come back again and have it rechecked. And that's very much like with Belbin. You've got a snapshot. This is now. Then you take that information and you want to learn, you want to work, you want to develop, you want to understand why people are seeing different things perhaps than you are, and you're working on it. And then you're going to go back to the doctor. So you're going to be redoing it and you're going to find out if that has made any difference. So it's something that is ongoing. It's something you can work on. Right. Some more questions here. Hang on a second. So I've got 2 pages worth here. Culture. This is coming up a fair bit, Vicky. I know this was emailed to me before the webinar. Is what influence does culture have on team roles? So
Okay.
that's a bit of a broad one, isn't it? But I know this is a really big question.
It is. And it's something that we've studied fairly recently. So we've looked at 24 countries where these are all countries where we've got representatives and lots of data that we can look at. Overall, we were looking at 190,000 people. Can you believe?
How many, sorry?
190,000.
Thank you.
And what we were trying to establish was what are the differences? Is there sort of variability? And we were actually doing this with a view to, in our products. At the moment, we haven't talked about norm bases, but we use an international norm base. So when people are completing the SPI, we're comparing them to a global population essentially. And we wanted to find out, are there any, is there sort of any variability that we're missing out on here? So we studied these different countries, and we were looking at 2 different questions. Firstly, we were looking at, is there lots of variation within particular team roles in different countries? And then was there lots of variation between roles, so the relationship between roles in different countries? And in general terms, our findings were that there wasn't masses of variability. We could sort of identify things here and there, but it didn't have significant bearing on how we inferred team roles, which is essentially the question. We did have some interesting findings, which I will endeavour to bring up in just a second. You can carry on.
No, it's fine. So I'll fill in the gap whilst I love the fact that we've got quite a delay as well, even though you are just up the road. I think that is but no, this is really interesting, and we have this data because we have distributors worldwide. So we have, I think, over 50 distributors. We have Belbin's translated into, I always get this wrong, about 25 languages.
Something like that, yeah.
Something like that. So we do have a wealth of data to be able to really interrogate, to find out what is the influence of culture on our behaviours within a team.
Yeah, so this was the first sort of question that we examined. This graph is kind of treating countries as belonging to a population of countries, if you like. So what we're trying to look at is the variability, and obviously you can see for plant they fit quite neatly along that line. So what these sort of crosses are, they're modelled means for each country, and so what we've got is kind of a normal distribution, if you like. There's quite low variability between the roles. If I just show you the next one, which is not coming up on the screen.
I do.
Sorry.
No, it's fine, Vicky.
So untypical.
It's so useful that we are able to do this, especially as the teams that we work in now are very multicultural, aren't they? We have people from all over the world in our organisations, and so you need to know that, you know, are they measuring the same things?
Absolutely, yeah. This is another example. This is Shaper. You can see there's a little bit more variability. And so the ones that are sort of further away from the line, those are considered the outliers. So in this case, France at the top there. But what we found was that there was no one country that was an outlier overall. So we found lots of different pockets of difference here and there. But also here we're looking at the mean. So what this equates to is sort of around the 50th percentile mark, whereas actually with team roles, preference tends to be much higher up, you know, around the sort of 70 plus. That's where we infer team role strength. So what we found was that not only were there not many significant outliers, but also that it tended to be around the middle of the profile which is not where we necessarily spend the time in terms of the team role reports.
Brilliant. No, thank you for that, Vicky. That was really useful.
Sorry, we talk about the other part of it.
Oh, please, sorry.
Okay, so I'm just going to bring up, this is kind of the second part of the question that we looked at. So here we were looking at the difference between roles. We were using principal component analysis. This is basically looking at correlations between roles. And this was our sort of overall fingerprints. This was taking all the countries together and looking at these sort of relationships between roles. And what you can see here is essentially is a team role circle. I don't know, yeah, yours is an opposite one, isn't it? So a little like what Jo's got behind her, you can see that there are, where you've got roles close together, those are the ones that were correlated. Where you've got them diagonally opposite, that was a negative correlation. So what we can see, for example, is that RI, resource investigator and completed finisher, are negatively correlated, as were implementer and plant. So, you know, the creative and the practical. And then you can't really see because they're sort of overlaid in the bottom quadrant, but you've got the specialist and the team worker there opposite the coordinator and the shaper. So that really kind of showed up rather beautifully, those opposites. And you've got the monitor evaluator, which in every different geographical area that we looked at, the monitor evaluator was the one that tended to move around, but it always stuck close to the axes. And I think that's a perfect illustration of a monitor evaluator. They're always on the fence. So the monitor evaluator one was the one that sort of moved in relation to other roles, but it's always separate. It is keeping that kind of distance from the team. So yeah, it was quite a neat illustration really of what team roles are and what they do.
That's perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Vicky. And there is so much depth. We have a copy of this report, actually, which I'll put on the email that we send out to everybody. I just drew the opposites look whilst you were talking. And what we found is when we looked at team roles, we found that some were very different to others. So we have that coordinator specialist, you know, the generalist, the specialist, the plant and the implementer. They're coming up with the ideas, then desperately wanting to do something practical with them. The task of the shaper, just get it done with but people matter of the team worker, and the completer finisher asking the resource investigator, can you just finish one thing before we get on to the next? But with that monitor evaluator not necessarily having an opposite, because like you said, they're very much out of that team because they're taking that dispassionate view. It's quite interesting with these opposites. I think what we'll do, we've got quite a few questions coming in now. Right, I'm going to do this one because I think this is an interesting one. If team members' score on team worker is very low, what are the possible actions? For example, coaching, counselling. What should we do if, so we might answer this differently, Vicky, this might be quite an interesting one. So if somebody's least preferred team role was team worker, what advice would you give?
I think it depends why you want them to have team worker. I don't have very high team worker. No one's ever tried to work on it. I don't know what that is. I think it depends. And it's also, I think you need to be quite careful about, I don't know, perhaps kind of organisational cultural biases. When I say culture, I mean of the organisation. I think if there's a particular problem, if there's a problem with the way that somebody's interacting, that may or may not be a team worker issue. But if there's negative behaviour that's affecting the team, the report's the place to start. And I think if you're seeing behaviours that indicate that, you know, that more team worker behaviours might be useful, then that's one thing. But I would question why necessarily you need to do that. Is it because everybody else in the team is quite high team worker and finds it difficult to have someone different? In which case, actually, is that diversity quite a positive thing? You know, so long as we're not conflating team worker with you know, politeness or getting on, because those are quite different things. I think it's important to recognise that diversity. Also, I think if a score is really low, if it's in the least preferred roles, it's going to be very difficult to drag it all the way up the profile. I think when we look at what I've been referring to, the preferred roles, the manageable, the least preferred, with our least preferred, those are kind of, you know, if there's no one else in the office, I'm going to have to do it. But it's not necessarily the area that we're going to look to cultivate. Those would be the manageable roles. So yeah, I would start with, and you may have a different answer, Joe, but I would start with, why are we looking to do this? Are we uncomfortable? And if we are, is there a way that we can use this person's strengths rather than trying to pull something else further up?
I agree with you. I agree with you entirely. I'd ask why, because what we do say at Belbin is you're finding out your strengths, and what you want to do then is develop those strengths. With your manageable roles, the ones in the middle, know that they're there and that you should develop them in case the team needs them. But if you've got something as a bottom team role, you know, the one that's right at the bottom, the amount of time and energy you would expend trying to get that slightly up further would potentially detract from the strengths that you're already giving to the team, that the team is already using. So I would very much say delegate. And this is why we need to find out. I mean, team roles is not just about the individual. It's what does the team, what behaviours does the team need? And saying, right, well, in that case, we need to share as well all of our strengths and weaknesses. And I need to find somebody else we need to find somebody else who has got team worker, don't we? We need to find that person and allow them to play to their team worker strengths whilst we're playing to our other strengths. So it's very much a case of us, you know, why would you want somebody to do that? But also, we all know that we're far more engaged in the workplace, aren't we, if we play to our strengths? I think the stats say at least you're 6 times more likely to be engaged if you play to your strengths once a day. But whatever you do, do not use it as an excuse. Just because my bottom role's completer finisher doesn't mean that I can just dismiss it. If there's nobody else to check stuff, I'm just going to have to do it. It's just going to require more chocolate and tea to do that.
And I think valuing those roles as well, it's not just, oh, it's got to be done. It's actually, because I don't have it, you know, just to understand the value that that role brings rather than to be dismissive of it. And I think that's quite important as well. Absolutely.
Project teams, Vicky. So this has just come up. Would you use Belbin to select a project team? I would say, actually, just whilst you're getting that up, I've seen it used beautifully to select project teams, because what you're doing is you're really starting with what is it the team's there to achieve, and breaking down those elements of work and then allocating behaviours to them and then allocating people to those behaviours. Would you say that, Vicky? I like that slide, by the way.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love this slide because I think, again, this gets back to kind of the beginnings of Belbin. So rather than, here's our team, let's Belbin them, and then let's try and crack on a bit with what we were doing. This is, you know, when you've got the opportunity, as you do sometimes with a project, to actually start a team from scratch, that's, I think, where, you know, it really comes into its own, because what you've got here is, you know, the plant and resource investigator at the beginning, they're going to be really engaged because they're in the ideas phase, and that's when they really shine. And then you can bring the monitor evaluator in to, you know, to look at those ideas. They won't have to be involved in that kind of beginning bit, which would be disastrous if they were, because they'd just be knocking everything down before it had a chance to kind of ruminate. And then you get through to the, you know, the implementation and the detail. You have got roles that, you know, can be there all the way through. You've got coordinator there bringing the bigger picture. the shaper, I mean, you might need at any stage, you know, if things are sort of grinding to a halt, that could be the ideas phase, you know, people are all over the place, or it could be the completed finisher's hanging on and doesn't want to let go of it and just wants to do one more check. So you need that drive. You need the team worker providing that support and adaptability. And the specialist, again, could come in at any point. But I think what this illustrates so well is not just using people's strengths, but actually knowing when to exclude people. And therefore, you haven't got this antagonism all the time of, why am I here? I hate this bit. You know, there's ideas flying around, nothing's concrete. That's, you know, that's the implementer. We haven't got the resource investigators saying, you know, they want to be on to the next thing. They don't want to be sort of crossing the T's and dotting the I's. So I think, you know, it's using people's time and skills. And I think when you look at you know, people who are involved in lots of kind of cross-functional teams, it's really being able to dip in and out and provide the most value that you can by being there at the right stage of a project.
Brilliant. No, that's wonderful. Thank you very much, Vicky. And I think the projects teams and using Belbin to help you with your projects is a really practical use, and we're seeing it by organisations all the time, just breaking down what does that project mean, what work needs to be done. It's a beautiful practical use of it. There's some questions coming in now, Vicky, about correlation between Belbin and various other tools. I don't want to spend too much time here really, because tools measure different things, so it's difficult to compare Belbin with MBTI or anything else, because they're looking at coming from different viewpoints, aren't they? They're measuring different things. It's like trying to compare apple and pears a lot of the time. Would you agree, Vicky?
Yeah, it is, and I think also if they started from different standpoints, which I think we were sort of talking about at the beginning,
Yeah.
Some are, you know, they're kind of Jungian typology, or they're looking at personality, and I think you kind of lose something when you try and say, okay, this equates to this role. You kind of lose the nuances of each and what each is useful for doing. But yeah, I would say, yeah, you can find other models which you think, oh, that role sounds a little bit like that one. But I think it's, yeah, for the most part, it's just useful to remember that Belbin is about behaviour, that it came from that kind of, that base really of starting with the team. So I think it's not something that we spend a huge amount of time doing, is kind of mapping it onto other models.
Perfect. And I think this answers another question that's just come in as well, the relationship between the team role and personality. And we talked about that right at the very beginning, didn't we? Is that personality is who am I? The team role is looking at behaviour. So obviously the personality informs the team role, but there's so much other stuff that also influence your team role behaviours as well, isn't there?
Definitely. I think, you know, when you look at Meredith's writing and the original research, he started off looking at personality because those tools were already available. So that the psychometric tests was something that they were already using as a starting point. And he discusses introversion and extroversion and those things as well. And it becomes quite apparent that, you know, some roles lend themselves to that, you know, the outgoing resource investigator. But I think it's difficult to map them exactly, and I think, as you say, they're doing two very different things. I think the emphasis with Belbin is more on how that plays out, rather maybe perhaps personality things, I don't know. Personality tests are used more for kind of individual coaching, but with Belbin, I think the applications are, as you say, more broadly with teams and just that really practical. What are we going to do? How does our team look and how does it work?
Yeah, absolutely. I would really like you to show, now this isn't a question, it's just because I think it's fascinating, is can we look, please, at those common team role contributions, those common pairings of team roles, because we're not just one thing, we're a wonderful mix of all of these 9 roles, aren't we? And what we want to do to look at really looking at not just your top, but your top 2, your top 3, your top 4 team roles. And it's interesting because this brings up the subject of what we're talking about very briefly earlier, is about opposites, team roles that are very different from themselves.
Definitely, yes. So these are interchangeable combinations. So it's whether you have the role sort of first or second. It's we were looking at sort of overall trends really, because we had a feeling that some combinations came up more than others, but it's useful to see that borne out in the data. So you can see by far and away the most popular was the completed finisher specialist, which I try not to take personally, and the completed finisher implementer. Those roles do tend to sort of fit together. You've got the refining, you know, the completed finisher, the detail, and the love of learning. You've also got, and obviously the two sort of task focus, the implementer wanted to get it done and the completed finisher wanted to get it right, and that combination is fairly common. You've also got plant resource investigator, because those, again, two sort of slightly different kinds of creativity. The plant is very much the sort of blank page. The resource investigator is sort of like the mood board. It's drawing things from, you know, from different influences and saying, how can we use this, and, you know, add a bit of this into the mix. So those tend to be found together quite commonly as well. And as you say, what we notice is the smallest bars, a couple of the smallest bars are team role opposites. So the shaper team worker, quite a difficult combination to achieve, because you've got that real drive, that being quite a hard line, but then also being the supportive team worker. So that's quite an interesting sort of dynamic for the top two team roles. As you mentioned earlier, the completed finisher and resource investigator, being somebody who's very outgoing and kind of bouncing around and coming up with lots of new things, but then also attending to the detail. I mean, the lack of that attention to detail is usually the kind of flip side of resource investigator. It's the allowable weakness. So to have those two things in combination is more rare. So I think this is quite a nice sort of illustration of that some of the roles that, as we saw in that sort of team role circle, that are more sort of closely correlated, this kind of fits in with that. And it gives us, I think the other thing is to say, it gives us an idea of scale. So for example, the roles that have plants in them, the plant's quite original. With plant, a little goes a long way in the team, whereas you might need several implemented completed finishers to bring that plant's ideas to fruition. So it makes sense that you find some in greater numbers than others, and that's kind of borne out in our background data, in our norm base as well. But yeah, I like this slide too. It's a real sort of eye opener really, but it fits in, I think, with lots of what we've discussed.
No, it does. I love this because it does show that any combination is possible. And to just say I am A is really no use. Every combination is, it may be rare, but it's still there. We're still seeing it as well. So what we haven't talked about are norm databases, Vicky, which I know that I've got on my list, and I know that this is something that is coming up. I'm just whizzing through the chat and the Q&A at the moment.
Yes, I think as we've touched on observers, we've touched on, as you were saying, the report and all the feedback that you get. But I think one of the key things in terms of the way that we handle Belbin and the way that we turn scores into our sort of team role understanding is the norm base. So when you complete a self-perception inventory, we're not just adding up those scores and chucking them on the page, but you're actually, those scores are being compared to our population, our database, which is around 9,500 SPIs. That's not by any means how many people have completed Belbin, that's just the database that we use for comparison. So what we're doing is we're translating a team role score into a percentile, and that percentile represents where you are, your strength of contribution within the population. Because again, it's not about you in isolation, it's about how strongly that contribution is likely to come across. So that's what the norm base does, is it turns that score into a percentile. And you know, the rarer that team role is within a population, if your score is high, then you're going to be a higher percentile for that role. And when we're looking at strength of role, that's one of the things that we're looking at, is how defined and sort of clarified is that role within your profile. Are you somebody who kind of does quite a lot of things, but you know, has the more sort of manageable roles, or are you very defined in terms of your preferences and things that you don't want to be doing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's important to say that there's no point measuring yourself against it, but you need to measure yourself against something. There's no point having a score of, unless you know what that's like compared to the general population, is there? And we do keep looking at these norm databases. I think that's also important to say, that from the work that was done back in the 1960s to now, we're almost at our eighth version of Belbin, which we're constantly updating and adapting and ensuring that it's still measuring what it's there to measure. And I think that's really important, these norm databases, that we keep an eye on them, and when they change, you know, a fair amount, you can tell that I'm technical, they change a fair amount, and we will research that, and if we do need to change that norm database, we have done, and we will do, because we have to make sure that the work that Belbin is doing and what we're reporting about is current and it is up to date.
Same with the inventories as well. The inventories have changed. And that's another reason to make sure that you're really up to date with Belbin, is that language has changed. And we looked at the people that were on that course, and we wouldn't compare our data with that world, and our language has changed as well. So what we do with the items that are in the self-perception inventory and the observers all go through norming as well, is that we make sure that each kind of item is pulling its weight. So everything measures team roles as well as it can. And that's something we spend quite a lot of time with, not just in English, but we measure that across all of the languages. So every translation goes through that kind of health check. And there's a lot of work there, as you say, in making that as good as it can be.
Absolutely. Somebody here is saying that behaviours are recognised as about delivering values in a team, things like integrity, you know, those kinds of behaviours. It's very important, I think, that that's different to a team role behaviour, isn't it? I think we make sure that we're just talking about team role behaviours, Belbin behaviours, those behaviours that are required within a team, that we know for that team to be successful. We don't want to mix that up with things such as integrity, trust, etc. Do we want to make sure we keep those separate?
Absolutely, yes. As you say, they can be measured, but not by Belbin.
Yeah, absolutely. Somebody else has said, which team combination is best? Well, obviously it's my combination. There is no best. That's the wonderful thing about Belbin, is that every single team role is needed. They're not all needed at the same time, but there's no one which is better than any others. So please don't try and value. Sometimes we find organisations value some team roles over others. We find people recruit, you know, and look at certain Belbin team roles. Their organisations become quite biased. But no, there is no better team roles.
I think you were talking earlier about the team report, weren't you, Jo? And the fact that you can get stuck as sort of in a particular organisational culture and think, oh, actually, what really works well is having high monitor evaluators. And then you discover, well, actually, nobody's coming up with ideas anymore, because everyone's got to be a monitor evaluator, and ideas aren't seen as the way forward. So you do have to kind of guard against that, which team role's best.
Absolutely. Another question here, project teams tend to be made up of specialists. How can Belbin recognise and develop a balanced team? This is where sometimes putting together somebody's specialism and their team, these are two separate things. You can be a specialist, but not in the Belbin team roles type of specialist. And I think it's very much looking at the difference between that functional role and the role that the behaviours that you have and you're bringing to a team.
Absolutely, yeah. The specialist is, as you were saying at the beginning, is that kind of love of learning. It's the getting into the subject in depth. And I think, yeah, we do need to kind of guard against looking at that as a functional thing, because apart from anything else, then we look at it only as operating in certain industries or certain areas. But you can find that kind of behaviour anywhere. And the value that it brings to the team isn't necessarily, you know, a technical, whatever it may be. It's one of those sort of, it's quite difficult, isn't it, to pin down, I think, but it is that sort of love of learning. It's the autonomy as well, the being self-starting and really being able to kind of delve into a topic in depth. But it needs to be directed, doesn't it? It needs to be coming from the coordinator, perhaps. This is what the team needs. It's not just what you're interested in.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a great, so surprisingly, Vicky has written a very good article actually about project teams in Belbin. So I'm going to put that in the link because a few people are asking that. So the email that I will send out tomorrow is going to have information there. We're down to the last 5 minutes. So I'm going to quickly go through. I know it doesn't time just goes by so quickly. So somebody's asked for a new project team. If they've not worked together before, do we look at their SPI? There are two answers to this, I think, is yes, start off with their self-perception inventory. Then ask for observer assessments 3 to 4 months down the line once they've got to work together, because you're going to have a true reflection then, aren't you, of your behaviours. However, the other answer to that question is do it at the beginning, because you never know what first impressions that you are making to others. So it's actually really useful information if you have a observation right from the very beginning when they don't know you very well, because at least you get an idea of what people think when they first start working with you. But ideally 3 months at least, wouldn't you say, Vicky?
Yeah, I think obviously it depends on the lifetime of the project team as well, doesn't it? But
Yeah.
yeah, there are a few situations in which you'd have to start off with self-perception, I think, just so that you weren't, so that you're not getting bad data, essentially, that people know when not to comment.
Absolutely. Somebody else, if you have a team that is working against each other, what is a good way to help them see where they fit together to work together? Jacqueline, I'd say use this. I ran a team session. I mean, they're all getting on very well, actually. This morning, I did a virtual team workshop for a couple of hours. And you start off with everybody understanding their strengths and weaknesses. So you start with the Belbin reports, with the SPI and the observers. But then you get people to share that. Get them to put their strengths on Post-it notes. Find out where the gaps are within the team, where the overlaps are within the team. Get them to understand that every single one of these team roles is needed, and ask questions. And then you'll find that the team tends to almost solve any issues that they have, because they suddenly realize, oh my goodness, it's because somebody's very different to me, or so on and so forth. Yes, I don't think there's too much to add there. We've got some great resources on our website. Or I can just come do the session for you. Yes, we have a team in Asia Pacific. So yes, we can get those details to you. If there's so many more that have come up. There is a wonderful one. Can this help internal team development? Absolutely, John, it really can. And this is where I'd say we are used most of all. If you've got teams that they just need to go up a gear, they need to start really performing. And so Belbin is a lovely way, again, starting here and having those conversations. But I will put a link to that in more detail afterwards. How are you feeling, Vicky?
Good, yeah. I just thought when you said that, I was thinking about whether that would be a virtual context, but I think that we haven't had time to talk about that. It's a whole other topic, because it's something that we're doing more and more now, isn't it, I think?
Yeah, there is so much now, and we've been looking at some research. Vicky's actually got some current research going on about how this is all influencing when we are working remotely. So, Vicky, can I ask you to come back once you've had a chance to crunch those numbers?
Absolutely, yeah. We've got some interesting things coming up already about the difference between individual engagement, productivity, and actually engaging with the team. So, I've only sort of begun the first part of the analysis, but it's interesting that, perhaps there's this drive to be really productive and be doing things and really keep the wheel turning. But actually, in terms of the things that we perhaps miss about being together and co-located, as they call it, is that sort of that team engagement, the shared conversations, the informal opportunities, I think, to discuss things that are going on. So yeah, lots of interesting stuff coming up too.
Fabulous. We'll invite you back on. So, my goodness, we've covered a heck of a lot. We've covered and we've looked at some wonderful pictures from the past, where Belbin came from, looking at all the research was done, then got a snapshot there. If you want some more information about that management teams, it's got Joe's copy, because I found it, Vicky, is a great one which has all the history in there. We've looked at the difference in culture, about age, about the difference between your personality, your behaviour. Team roles actually was there because we wanted to know why teams were successful, and we realised, the research showed that you need these 9 different behaviours for a team to be successful. And Vicky shared some wonderful stuff with us. I will be in contact with an email. Vicky, come on, you wrap up everything you before we say goodbye.
I think we've talked a lot about about culture, about valuing different roles, about the opposites and the value of that. I think the final thing to say, and again, we haven't had a lot of time to explore it, is that this is something that boosts performance. It's not a nice to have. This is something that we found, and I think, you know, with your work in China, Jo, as well, which we haven't touched on, we found that having those roles present in the team, not necessarily all at the same time, but having those contributions enhances performance. Behavioural diversity, difference of approach enhances performance, and this is the key to Belbin. It's not just about understanding yourself better, but it's also about what the team needs, and it's about boosting that performance and making things work for the team and for the organisation.
Perfect. Perfect. Yeah, this isn't a touchy-feely. This isn't just to make everybody feel good. It's there to improve the performance. It's performance related. Wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. We're going to stay on for the next 5 minutes, maybe 3 minutes, if you do have anything else, but otherwise we will be in contact, and please do join in at other webinars. So thank you so much, and it's a goodbye from me, and it's a goodbye. Thank you so much, Vicky. That was fab.